All right, listen up. We are covering scientific literacy today, which is just a fancy way of saying learning to read and write like a scientist instead of like someone who gets their information from social media comments. We're also going to talk about the paper you'll be writing because apparently inflicting academic suffering on undergraduates builds character. So, your research paper is going to be a standard scientific research paper, not some creative writing exercise about your feelings or a philosophical meditation on the meaning of existence. It will have all the major components that real scientists use when they want other scientists to take them seriously, okay, which is harder than you might think given the general state of human intelligence. You're looking at about 5 pages of actual writing, the meat of the paper, not including all the garnishes. That's 5 pages of content in addition to some other pieces that are required of a research report, including things like a title page, an abstract, the summary of the project, which you guys aren't doing for this. Well, I might have you do it. I'll let you know if you're going to do it. It's not required by APA, but it might be good for you anyways. And definitely a reference page as well, okay? So before you start hyperventilating about page counts, remember that 5 pages of scientific writing is different from 5 pages of padding and fluff that you might have gotten away with in high school English class or whatever, okay? Every sentence needs to earn its place. It's meatier writing. It's more impactful writing. Like there's not allowed to be any fluff or padding in a scientific paper. Okay, so in some ways it's harder, but in some ways it's also easier because you've got the methods, you've got the results with the statistics and so on, which is just sort of just explaining what you did, and that's easier to write in some ways. So it's harder and it's easier. Here's my beautiful infographic that shows you what this academic torture device will look like when you're done. You will have a title page, because even scientists need to introduce themselves properly, and abstract, most likely, because busy researchers want to know if your work is worth their time, right, before committing to reading the whole thing. About 5 pages of body text, which is going to cover your introduction, your methods section, your results, your discussion, the 4 horsemen of the academic apocalypse, right? And finally, a reference page, because you have to give credit where credit is due. You know, in a civilized society, that's still a thing, right? So we'll be using professionally respected sources, peer-reviewed sources, and that's sort of what we're here to talk about today. How do we use professional sources? How do we cite them? We're going to be going over all of that. So you need to use 5 to 10 sources, and most of us will be hedging on the larger side of that, okay? You want to aim more towards 10. And I know you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of articles to read, but you come to find out that they all serve their purpose, and that we're all going to be working with different types of information, and it's really not as hard as it seems, okay? We'll go through that so it doesn't seem as overwhelming. You'll be collecting 10 for your references assignment, so you'll have plenty to pull from when you start to write your paper, okay? So let's talk about the torture plan, okay? How we're going to build this academic monster step by step. We're starting with the reference page, which seems backwards until you realize you can't write about research you haven't found yet, okay? It's like trying to conduct a psychological assessment before gathering any behavioral observations. It's technically possible, but it's inadvisable and it's probably going to end badly. So the first paper section that we turn in this class is the reference page, which seems interesting that the very last page would be the first that we complete, but we need to have some reference material before we can start writing, okay? So here's how this academic assembly line works. First, you'll complete your references assignment, where you'll collect 10 potential sources, and this gives you a pool of research to draw from and forces you to actually engage with the literature before you start making claims about what research shows. Most of you will use 5 to 10 of these sources in your final paper. So having 10 gives you options and the luxury of discarding weaker sources. And you can find more later on too if you discover that you don't like these references. Okay, once you learn how to find them, it's not that difficult. After you've demonstrated that you can find and properly format academic sources, which is a skill that apparently requires explicit instruction in this digital age, we'll move on to writing the actual paper sections. We'll work through them in the order that they appear in the final document, because logical progression is important in the academic universe. So, yeah, your introduction comes next, where you'll synthesize your literature review into a coherent narrative. I don't know if you guys can hear the kids screaming outside, but I'm down at the beach and people are having a very good time. So let me close that window. Hopefully that's better. All right, so what were we talking about? So yeah, you're going to have a literature review, your introduction section, basically, where you look at all the literature, all the references that you found, and you turn them into a coherent narrative, and that's going to set up your research question. Then your method section, where you'll explain exactly what you did, so that future researchers can either replicate your brilliant work and learn from from what you've done, or they can point out that you've made a mistake and that you screwed up. That's the risk you take when you publish. Results follow, where you'll present your findings without editorial commentary, okay, a skill that is surprisingly difficult when we're accustomed to having opinions about everything, but that's not the place for opinions. And then finally, your discussion section, where you get to interpret what your results actually mean and acknowledge all the ways your study could have been better, okay? That's where you get to put your opinions in. So each section builds on the previous one and requires that you've actually absorbed the material rather than just going through the academic motions and jumping from topic to topic as we normally do in our classes. So this sequential approach ensures that you develop genuine expertise in your topic instead of just assembling like a paper-shaped collection of paragraphs, okay? All right, so the beautiful world of APA format. So last point with all of that is it's going to follow APA format. We've talked about APA a little bit up until this point. APA is the American Psychological Association, and they have publication guidelines that we will follow to make sure our papers are up to snuff with other papers, make sure that we're following the same formatting. Scientific papers follow the same formatting so that they're easier to read, easier to digest, so that we can find what we're looking for easily when we approach a scientific paper. We'll come to learn that when we start to read them ourselves, okay? We're working with the 7th edition of APA, which means they've changed things just enough to make what I learned in school useless, so I had to relearn this. So that's what we'll be discussing here. Progress is wonderful that way. But before we get into APA format, we'll just talk a little bit about citing works. Why do we cite? How do we cite? How do we do it well? The idea is that we will be citing in 2 places. You'll be citing in the paper when you bring up that person's idea or their results, and you'll also be referencing them on the last page of your paper, that reference page. Again, we'll be doing our reference page separately and first. So you'll have a reference page to reference throughout the course. So that's where we'll be citing. We'll have a bibliography, well, a reference page, okay, where all our references are held. And then as you bring up these ideas in your paper, you will cite inside of your paper. And I kind of do the references and the introduction section together, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I'll have a little separate video on that to make it easier, so I'll post my shortcut method of doing this. But I'm just going to go through this and talk about what's required first, and then I'll show you my shortcut method. Okay, citations, the art of not stealing. So before we move forward, the first thing we really ought to discuss is that we're not simply taking other people's ideas and inserting them into our paper and claiming them as our own. Okay, that would be plagiarism. But it's interesting because in scientific writing, we're hoping to just present information in as much of a factual way as possible. So it often seems like we should just take someone else's words and put them into our paper to get across what they're trying to say. But it's not that clear cut. There's a level of interpretation for us as well. So when you're citing works, you're going to use other people's ideas in your own words. You have to give credit when you use someone's idea, refer to something that is not common knowledge, and believe it or not, many things are not common knowledge. I'll be sure to point this out in our papers if we do encounter this, but you should have a citation after nearly every sentence. I mean, unless it's so obvious that, you know, those kids screaming outside would already know it, there should be a citation, which I know seems crazy, but we'll take a look at what a good introduction section or what a good discussion section that includes references will look like, okay? You have to use a citation when you quote another person's actual spoken or written words, which shouldn't happen very often. That's an occasional thing. However, something we'll talk about a little further on here is, well, I guess not however, but okay, basically, let me get my thoughts straight here. We're more likely to be paraphrasing others, okay? You'll have little to no quotes in your paper, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. You'll mostly be paraphrasing another person's spoken or written words. Okay, I hope that's clear. Sorry if I confused you there for a second. I confused myself. So it's like analyzing a case study like in abnormal psychology. You don't just repeat what the patient said verbatim. You synthesize their symptoms, behaviors, history into like a clinical picture. Your job is to take raw information, turn it into scientific understanding. Okay, I'll get into that more as we go along and in the shortcut video that I'll post. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about using APA. Some of the more exciting information we talk about in this class, it's a little dry, we're talking about formatting, okay, but we can't forget that the formatting serves a purpose. The uniformity of our references and citations make it easier for other researchers to find and cite work, which makes the entire scientific process easier, so we can't overlook it. I have a couple examples here. The next couple slides are examples of APA format. So in the text of the paper, if you make a statement like the one I have here, you would put in parentheses after that statement the authors that you got the information from and the year that that information was published. Then on your reference page, I have an outline of the information that's needed as well as this particular example inserted into the outline. What do we need to include? We need to include the author or authors. Sometimes we have one, sometimes we have many, and we'll get into what we do with many authors momentarily here. Authors are listed by last name and their initials. Then we include the year. Year is also very important because year explains when that finding was found. Pretty simple idea. Remember that science does work chronologically. We build on each other's ideas. So a study that came out this year is going to carry a different weight than a study that came out 30 years ago. Okay? That doesn't mean it's not important or valid still. Okay? It's just that if it's newer, then we usually give it a little bit more credit. But that doesn't mean you should discredit an older study. We include the title of the article in sentence case, meaning you write it like a sentence. The first word will be capitalized and any proper nouns will be capitalized, but otherwise every other piece of the title is lowercase. We have the name of the periodical or the journal. We are mostly going to be citing from journals. So remember all the way back to one of our first topics in the class where we talked about peer-reviewed articles. That's our highest form of science, okay? That's science that's been graded by other scientists, so to speak. So we want to know what publication this came from and that it's a peer-reviewed publisher. Do not cite anything that is not peer-reviewed. That is not good science. A few exceptions. You might cite something because, I don't know, you're talking about social media use and maybe you cite something off of social media or Reddit or something like that, okay? So you might put in that you have a quote from a Reddit user, okay? But that, again, that's another rare thing, just like quotations, period, are rare. Then we include the volume and the issue number. Most journals will have this structure where they have the volumes and issues of their journal. You'll include those here, page numbers, and then we have what we call a DOI. We'll talk about those in a minute as well. Think of this like conducting a clinical interview. Every piece of information serves a diagnostic purpose. Okay, the author tells us who conducted the research, the year tells us when this knowledge entered the scientific record, the journal tells us what level of peer scrutiny it underwent, and all the numbers help us locate the exact source, okay, like the patient's demographic, I guess. Okay. All right, DOIs. So we'll be pulling from online journals. So a few years ago, DOIs came on the scene. DOIs are an abbreviation for digital object identifiers. So it's meant to be a very quick way for individuals to find articles in the electronic format. These were the hot new thing a couple years ago, but surprisingly, they're not used as often as you might think. But we will learn how to use them because they're promising anyway in the digital age. They might become more popular as we go along. They're unique identifiers for a book or an article, just like an ISBN number or a barcode. So it's unique, and if you have it, you should be able to find where that particular information is available online. Again, this is a newer system. I will not require DOIs, but I'll show you a little later on that sometimes DOIs will be provided for you when you have an article. And if they provide it, you should use it, okay? And I'm just going to make sure that you're using it correctly. Okay, so this is an update from a previous version of APA. So if you're familiar with 6 or 7, the additions, we do have a change here where the DOI is actually listed as a hyperlink. It's listed as a website link instead of just identifying the number of the DOI. Okay, the idea, of course, is if someone's using your paper in a digital format and they have your reference page, they can just click your references right away, which is really great. Okay, but again, the system hasn't been broadly used just yet, so it's still gaining its footing, but good to know what they are, good to know how to use them, okay? So we're going to talk about a few other cases or scenarios when it comes to citing information. Sometimes no author will be listed. That's very unusual. Sometimes we have works that come from either so many authors or collaborators that they're simply not listed, or we have other cases in which an author is not listed, but say an agency or an organization is listed. So here's a major example and something that many of us might choose to cite in our papers, something like the DSM. If we're not familiar with the DSM, that's our diagnostic and statistical manual. It's how we diagnose mental disorders. It's a big book which lists all of the different criteria and symptoms that are needed for a diagnosis of any of our psychological disorders. And maybe you want to cite it, maybe you want to cite which of those symptoms are present in whatever it is you're researching. And just a side note, this would be an exception to the always only cite peer-reviewed, but it's one of the rare exceptions. So there's not a single author for the DSM because it's a body of large contributors that put their information into the DSM. So you would just be citing the association that it belongs to, which is the APA, the American Psychological Association, and you would put them in place of the author. You would still include the year, and it would look something like this. When we're using citations in text, meaning in the body of your paper, so you make a statement and then you want to cite it, there are a few ways to do this. I mentioned one where you make the statement and then in parentheses after your statement, you put in the author's name and the year, or you can embed that information into your writing. You can say, instead of citing after, list those authors before you run into the statement you're going to make. So this is where scientific writing sort of meets other types of writing you've maybe learned about before. We want our information to have a flow to it. If we were just simply listing off a bunch of information with citations afterwards, the flow would be a little hard to read. You still want a narrative to your paper. So we'll be looking at examples of this, and you'll be reading papers yourself, and you'll see this in action. So just keep in mind that there's more than one way to get an in-text citation across. Here's another specific scenario. If you have lots of authors, sometimes papers have many, many, many authors, so there's a new rule. This is also new to the 7th edition, where when you have to cite more than 3 authors, you would go ahead and put this into your paper. You would list all of the authors on your reference page, but in text, you would do something different. You would write the first author's name followed by the words et al, and then the year. So what does et al mean? It means and others in Latin, okay? I think this is abbreviated, the all is abbreviated. I think it means it's alii, if I remember my Latin correctly. So et is and in Latin, and alii is others, something along those lines. Meaning that we have a head author on that particular paper, and then there are others as well. If you're interested in who those others are, you can go to the reference page and find them. Again, if you're adjusting from our previous version of APA, it used to be such that on your first citation in the paper, you had to list all authors that were listed in the reference at the end of the paper, and then subsequent citations would have et al. But that's now changed. On your very first citation, you can use et al. For authors 3 or more. For papers with authors of 3 or more, or books with authors of 3 or more as well, okay? But if you have 2 or less, then you have to put all of them. So think of it like a research team in a longitudinal study. You have a principal investigator leading the project, but there are graduate students, postdocs, and collaborators of all kinds contributing. So rather than naming everyone every single time, which would be difficult to write and difficult to read, we acknowledge the lead researcher and then indicate that there are others involved. So here's another scenario. Maybe you're making a statement in which you have 2 different sources that would contribute to the statement. Then you would just cite both. Maybe you're citing the prevalence of a certain disorder. You could cite the DSM through the APA, and maybe another paper mentions it as well through their own research. So you can mention them both separated by semicolons. This is not limited to 2 papers. You can have 3 papers or 3 sources that point to the same idea, and you could also do this here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Remember the semicolon. All right, so how to sound smart without being pretentious. So now we're kind of out of the woods with APA. We'll be practicing APA throughout the course, writing our paper, but let's talk a little bit more about how to write a research paper since we're going to be doing it. We're going to start with reading articles, so we want to become literate in our topic. This whole topic we're on right now is called scientific literacy. It's about understanding or being literate in a certain topic, right? So how you start doing that is by collecting sources and taking notes, kind of writing down or creating a series of thoughts that are all linked together by the different sources that you have read. I include here, do not directly quote authors. So like I said, there might be an opportunity somewhere in your paper where you might quote somebody, maybe once, but beyond that, we do not quote regularly in scientific writing unless there's an exceptional need for it. So this might be very different than other writings that you have done in the past. We don't want to get in the habit of quoting authors. We want to get in the habit of writing down thoughts in our own words, explaining them how we understand them. So that'll be our first step. It'll be collecting some sources, taking notes on those ideas to get us ready to write the introduction to our topic, which is just that, and it introduces what's known about the topic and what you intend to investigate. Okay, so this is our first step here. So taking notes in your own words, rewriting in the present tense, it's another little scientific writing rule. If you're citing a paper, I have an example here of a 2015 paper. 2015 is obviously in the past, so it might seem logical to write in the past tense when you're referring to this paper. But when a paper is published, that's the best of our knowledge at that time. So that paper will state or contend something in particular, and we'll talk about it as if it is still true. And then what we could do, if a paper has since been disproven or challenged by another paper, we can talk about what that paper states or contends. Okay, it's possible to find conflicting information out there. There are plenty of topics where scientists disagree, but we will write about their thoughts in the present tense, and you'll write about them in your own words, citing like this. You'll say what they stated, what they contend, in your own words, through your own understanding. So it's not that you're stating your opinion, but you're paraphrasing what the other authors said, okay, in order to support your research hypothesis. Okay, so one of my favorite analogies here, doing research, is sort of like being a lawyer. So I have kind of a multi-step analogy here. I have some symbols here. We have the scales of justice, and then we have this funky Greek letter, which is the Greek letter psi, which is the symbol for psychology. So as a lawyer, you frame a case, you search for evidence, you present the evidence, and then you make a closing argument. You make a conclusion about the case. Research is not much different. You start by defining your topic, defining your topic or framing your case, okay? You perform the research, which is like seeking out the evidence to support or not support your claim. You write the paper, present it, and you draw a conclusion. So you determine whether or not your hypothesis was supported. And if you remember back to hypotheses in our previous topics, we always have an alternative or a research hypothesis. And only one of 2 things can happen. We can have support for it or not. And we're doing that based on hypothesis testing, all of which we will continue to elaborate on in this course. Okay, I think it's a helpful way to think about it. But instead of a legal precedent, you're building on psychological theory and empirical evidence. So instead of convincing a jury, you're convincing the scientific community. And instead of like establishing guilt or innocence, you're establishing whether your hypothesis receives empirical support. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, writing like a professional. Some other general tips on scientific writing. Scientific writing is formal, so we want to treat it that way. So we avoid things like abbreviations, or at least we define abbreviations before we use them. Don't just start using like GAD if you haven't already elaborated on what that is previously. And if you don't know what that is, don't use it at all. So we avoid contractions. This is a big one because a lot of us naturally write with contractions, things like it's instead of it is, can't instead of cannot. But we avoid this in scientific writing. We avoid casual language, things like this is interesting because, or this interests me because, and you don't say me or I, okay? In science, plenty of things are interesting, but we don't report them as being interesting. We want to report them in terms of the information that's present, not what we think about it. We don't care about your opinion, except possibly in the discussion section. How we interpret it can be included, but what we think about it should not be included, okay? And we'll get more into the details of the discussion section as well, so that I'll clarify that even more. And again, we avoid self-reference. So this is actually a little bit complicated because this has changed in recent years. We actually seem to be more accepting of the word we in science. So it used to be something like, if the study was distributing a survey, you would write that up as the researchers distributed a survey. But now it's becoming a little more welcome that we can do something like we distributed the survey. So this is new to APA format. However, in this class, you are still going to avoid self-reference, okay? If you think there's a case for it, then contact me. I do not want you to use self-reference because this is something that you should be able to do and you should practice doing, okay? Remember that whatever makes it onto your page should be professional. There shouldn't be any casual language talking about yourself, why you chose the topic. You shouldn't say my hypothesis is, okay? You could say the study's hypothesis is. If you want to talk to me about that, that's fine, but if you're writing it up in a formal research report, it doesn't necessarily belong, okay? So there are plenty of things we want to avoid, and these are just some of them. All right, the last bit we'll talk about is the literature search. You all will be searching out resources for your paper, so we're going to do what we call a literature review, where you're going to search for sources. In addition to this recording that you're watching now, there will be a counterpart to this, where depending on what institution you're at, most of you, well, it doesn't matter which institution you're at, I'll provide instructions about how to access the databases with scientifically sound sources, peer-reviewed sources, the proper journal articles, all the things that you should be using if you're writing a legitimate scientific paper, okay? So be on the lookout for that. I think that's the very next video for you guys, is a database demonstration. And just in case I confuse you guys, I teach this at a few different schools, so I have a different database demonstration depending on the school that I'm at, so that's why I'm trying not to be specific about what institution you're at. Anyhow, let's take a topic, a very general topic. Let's start with anxiety, okay? Anxiety is a major psychological disorder. It's very prevalent, especially in the younger generations nowadays. Many, many people suffer with anxiety. So say that you want to use this as a topic in your paper. Maybe you're interested in specifically test anxiety in women of the college age group. Maybe that's what you want to investigate. But before you can investigate that, you need to have a broad understanding of what anxiety is, or maybe define anxiety for your reader. So it's always good to start broad, start with some of the general research on the topic. We also want to work with recent work. We talk about how year is important to state in a reference, and it's important because it places that piece of science in time and how much weight you're going to put on it. So again, citing something from this year is very different than citing something from the 1970s. Not to say that it may not be important, but you should have a good reason for citing old research over new research. Most of your research should be within the past 10 years, maybe 20 years. But starting with recent work lets you know where the field has left off, what's the most cutting-edge research in that field. That'll be the newest research in that field. So start broad, start general, start with recent work, and then you can work into more focused information from there, and you can work into older work from there as well if it leads you in that direction. And sometimes if it's very specialized research, then it will. So I think this really helps us to understand this. A literature review is going to inform your introduction, the introduction to your topic. You're going to review the literature, and you're going to write up an introduction to your topic that's going to end with your specific study and your hypothesis. So with this, we start broad, and then we narrow down to our specific interest. So we can take the same logic for our literature review as well. So I think we should think of this as a funnel again, and I'll bring up later that the rest of research, the rest of the report, it looks sort of like an hourglass, right? Actually, I think I already talked about that. We get very focused, and we focus in when we do our results, and then we sort of rebroaden our horizons. So you'll see that you will, or you have seen, that in another one of our lectures here on that hourglass shape, where we start broad, and then we get more narrow, and that's in order to inform the reader of the general ideas that you'll be addressing that lead into your particular topic. A reader needs to know what you're talking about before you get into your specific topic. Imagine you don't know anything about the research on anxiety that's out there, and then I just say, here's my experiment, and you're like, okay, but I don't really understand the topic. So you need to introduce the topic first, and then you get into your specifics. Okay, let's talk about why some sources are worth your time and some aren't, okay? The sacredness of the peer review. This is our last bit here on just general search strategy. We'll be using a search strategy that will only yield us scholarly articles. And by scholarly, we mean peer reviewed. We need professional sources, so there's some information on that here. We're just trying to provide information that's as unbiased as possible. And there's, of course, bias in science as well. We can find bias in our scientific papers, but the peer review process is meant to eliminate that as much as we can. So remember that peer-reviewed articles are usually of higher quality, almost always of higher quality. They've been overviewed by other professionals. It's like grading. They grade their work. Scientists grading other scientists. So that's what we're going to be looking for, peer-reviewed papers, because that's our best quality science. When you're reading research articles, approach them like analyzing behavior through different theoretical lenses. A behaviorist might focus on observable actions and environmental factors, while a cognitive psychologist might examine thought processes. So similarly, different researchers approach the same topic from various theoretical perspectives, and your job is to synthesize these viewpoints into a coherent understanding that supports your study. Okay, you can also pay attention to the research methodology being used in what you're reading. So just like different therapeutic approaches work better for different clients, different methods work better. Experimental designs allow us to establish causation. Correlational studies help to identify relationships. Qualitative studies provide a lot of rich, detailed understanding of something. So your literature search should mirror the way that we understand psychological development, starting with the broad foundational concepts and progressively focusing. So if you're studying academic stress, begin with general stress and coping theories from pioneers like Sallier and Lazarus, then move to educational psychology, research on academic environments, and finally narrow down to your specific population of, and variables of stress within the educational system. Okay, so this approach reflects, sort of like how psychological knowledge builds. Basic research, getting more specific. Your literature review should demonstrate this progression from general principles to specific applications. And then, let's see. I've talked about critically evaluating your sources before, so just briefly, gather information systematically, look for patterns, contradictions, consider alternative explanations, be aware of biases, limitations, pay attention to effect size, not just statistical significance, okay? As you develop your research question and hypothesis, you're basically creating like a theoretical case conceptualization for your study. So you want to draw connections between different areas of psychological research. And basically your introduction should tell a coherent story about how various lines of research converge on your specific question. Okay. All right. Just looking to see if there's anything else we really need to talk about. I think that's probably pretty good. Just approach this assignment with patience for the process and, respect for the intellectual tradition that you're joining. Every published researcher started out as a student struggling with APA format and, trying to figure things out. Focus on understanding your topic deeply rather than just meeting the minimum requirements, because it will make it so much easier for you to write the rest of the paper. Okay, so use the structure of the research paper as a framework for organizing your thought as well as, a template for your paper. Okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. If you have any questions, just let me know, and hopefully that was helpful.